Hey everyone, I'm Mr. Bushhouse. Thanks for doing this. I'm testing it out for the first time, so we'll see how it goes. If you hear a baby crying, that's my child, and I'll have to deal with that. The plan as we go forward is I'm going to do about a couple chapters a day. We'll do what I did in the past was I've done 4 weeks, so 4 days and 2 chapters, and then on the last one I've done 3. I know some of you have found the comments. If you could go ahead and type in questions as we go along, I'll feel free to answer those. And what I'm just going to do is kind of move forward with the broader content, and then I'll answer your specific questions as we go. I haven't done this before, and I don't have the thing on my computer that is going to allow me to show you the screen that I'm also using. So I'm going to go old-fashioned and just show you a different screen. And I see that it's going to be backwards, but hey, we'll roll with it. So I'm going to start with the Native Americans. So we're all the way back in the very, 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 very beginning with Unit 1. That's about 1491 to, for us, 1754. Something I do want to point out as we kind of start with this, remember the DBQ is going to come from sections 3 through 8, and periods 1 and 2 go up to the French and Indian War. So if you are rushed for time, then I would start with the French and Indian War and then go up to a little bit before Reagan. That's probably that's what the DBQ will come from. So focus your time on that. So we'll start with Native Americans. Obviously, you guys know there are a lot of different Native American groups. Something that I would remind you is to look at the nuance and the complexity. They're not all one monolith. They're not the same thing. So I would encourage you to kind of look back and see how they have some similarities, but also some differences. That way, as you go through it, you're going to if you get asked a question about this, then you'll be able to talk about the complexities within it instead of just being like, Native Americans are all the same, because that's not an APUSH answer. There's a couple theories in how they get here. There's the land bridge theory. There's the theory of coming over from the Pacific through hopping from different islands and small boats. There's also a theory where, and I guess I'll kind of consult this, I understand the maps a little backwards for you, but the idea that during the Ice Age, you have an ice shelf come down, and then what happened is the settlers came across from essentially Europe and just walked along the ice shelf and then stopped in North America. And then the ice went away, and then all of a sudden, that's what you get. They're stuck there. So a few different theories on that. In Central and South America, you have the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans. So those are some pretty substantial empires. I mean, I wouldn't just call them tribes. They are actually empires. So it's interesting to do some comparison between their civilization types and what we're going to see with the Europeans. And the thing that I'll point out as a bit of a judgment, when the Europeans show up, they're going to be viewing the Native Americans as uncivilized, even though if we want to take our ideas of civilization, that very much matches civilization. And so it's a little bit of that ethnocentrism that you'll see coming from the Europeans. Excuse me. In North America, you got the mound builders. Whoop, I skipped for you. You got mound builders, Mississippi River Valley. You got Pueblos in the Southwest. For around our area, we'll see Cherokee. We have a pretty substantial population in Cherokee and North Carolina, even to this day. So you'll see a lot of different Native American groups. They are, when you're looking at the differences between the Native American groups and the Europeans, I would definitely be looking at their view of the world. I would be looking at, okay. I would be looking at how they're going about getting food. They are going to be more of the agricultural based. Remember, we're not bringing over domesticated animals until you have the Columbian Exchange. They are matriarchal, and so they're going to be kind of that lineage can be passed down through the mother, which is not how the Europeans are doing things. The idea of land is communal. We're sharing the land. It's for our group. It's not just for us. And it's going to clash with the Europeans, absolutely. Excuse me. There's also that spiritual respect for the earth. I liken this to the idea of like the circle of life mentality. But this is, use all parts of the buffalo. We're going to honor the earth and what it has given to us. I always say in my class, I always talk about a connection here to, we're talking about climate change right now and the fact that we need to conserve the earth and we need to be more respectful of what the earth has done and not destroy it. That's conversations the Native Americans are having. Now, they don't know about global warming, but that idea of having respect for nature is then something you could tie all the way to modern times and maybe how we're not doing that. The big part of this unit is look at that culture clash between the Europeans and the Native Americans. The big idea is how are these two cultures kind of coming together and how is America emerging from that? And so when you look at your different thematic learning objectives, when we have things like American national identity, while there isn't in America, it is important to see how immigration is going to play a significant aspect on that. And we can tie immigration through all sorts of other things. Excuse me. I would also point out the encomienda system at this point. You definitely have forced slavery and things of that nature coming about by the Europeans. If we were to break down the different groups, so you should be familiar with that for the encomienda system. Excuse me. And looking at how at the very, 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 very top, so this is all racial based, at the very, very top, you have the native Spanish born in Spain. Below them, you have these new Spanish. They're going to be from Spanish parents, so they're ethnically Spanish, they're white, but they are actually being born in the New World. That's the only distinction between them and the people at the top. They're Spaniards born in Spain. Underneath them, you'd have the mestizos, your mixed population, and then you would have Native Americans, and at the bottom, enslaved persons who are primarily going to be African Americans. There's just rigidity to this. You can't bounce around and move throughout these different, throughout the pyramid itself. You're born where you are and you're stuck there. I would compare that to modern times, like for America today, where we have kind of a mix. Some of ours, you can argue some of your placement can be determined by a racial thing. For the most part, it's economic. So you can move, but there are definitely some racial factors that can play into the ability or the amount of economic wealth you can obtain and things of that nature. Excuse me. I'm going to move into colonization because that's actually America and that's what we care more about. So there's your nice little colonial regions. You have the northern, middle, and southern. The southern colonies start first. I guess I'll just throw this up here. You're looking at it and I get it's backwards. But this is Jamestown, 1607. That'll be the first settlement. That's going to be a permanent settlement. I will shout out Roanoke and the Lost Colony since we're in North Carolina. But Jamestown is going to be the first successful English and permanent settlement. Tobacco is the thing that keeps them alive. They come over and they just are kind of, I wouldn't say they're failures, but they make a lot of mistakes. They settle near swamps. They aren't growing food. They go out thinking, oh, we're just going to grab a bunch of gold and then go back home and everything's going to be great. And it's not, because that's not how the world is working at this time. Powhatan and his tribe are around there. They kind of walk into this. So there's that Pocahontas situation and that kind of forced I would say a stage, actually, this staged operation by Powhatan to kind of make John Smith notice that, oh, no, Powhatan is the one who has the power here. And so that's something that you could remember for that. Excuse me. I realize I'm doing all of this, and I didn't actually connect my AirPods to my thing. Someone write in, can you hear me? Is this any better? Okay, all right. Well, that was dumb. Thanks, Moya, for sending me a remind instead of talking in the thing, but appreciate it. Okay, all right. Is this better? Any better? Not better. Okay. Sydney said yes, so I'm going to go as this is better. Excuse me. So anyway, taking John Smith and then holding him and then kind of staging that whole I could have you killed, but I'm going to make my daughter save you to show that I truly have the power. So a little bit of a different twist than you probably heard in elementary school and things like that. Something significant, John Rolfe is going to be the one who is going to kind of, we'll say discover, but use that hybrid form of tobacco. Here's my dog, by the way, because he came over. So there's Dexter. Okay. Excuse me. Anyway, I got both of them over here bothering me. So no, he can't speak, so he can't do review. So that's That's not how that would work. Anyway, there is going to be indentured servitude. That's going to be the start of this. That is the headright system that's going to encourage wealthy investors to kind of pay the way for other people to come over to the New World. And those are going to be poor white people from England. We're not really using slaves at this point. They're pretty expensive, and they're just primarily not going to be used. And so it is important to keep that in mind. While we think about slavery in the South as like, those are the things, it does start with indentured servitude. There's the House of Burgesses, your first representative form of government in America. The thing that's going to start the transition to ending for indentured servitude is going to be Bacon's Rebellion. And so Nathaniel Bacon, a former indentured servant, because remember, indentured servants can go free. The former indentured servant has a couple issues. One, the indentured servants who are then free, right? They work off their contract. They end up going further and further west because they need land, and the land in the east is being taken by the rich farmers. So the land in the east is better, and so it is more expensive, and it's just not an option for them. Now, the problem is as they go west, they're butting into the Native Americans, and so these indentured servants like Nathaniel Bacon go to the House of Burgesses and they say, hey, look, support us. Let's go fight some of these Native American wars. Let's fight them, take some of this land back. And the House of Burgesses is like, no. And they don't want to do that. So these former indentured servants who are now poor farmers don't feel they're being represented in the House of Burgesses, which, I mean, that's legitimate. I mean, you can make a connection even today. For the most part, the people who are politicians are better off than most of the other people in America. That's just kind of how it works. And so they're upset about this, and they decide, you know what? This is a problem. Let's do something about it. We're not being addressed. And they just kind of start a rebellion and go burn down Jamestown. So the typical American way, when we're upset, we rebel against something. So they rebel, and long story short, it gets put down eventually. Bacon dies of dysentery. It's not a fun end for him. But what comes out of it most significantly is the rich farmers and planters start going, wait a minute, maybe we do want slaves, because these indentured servants are working with us for a short period of time. Then they're going free, and then they're becoming needy. They want stuff. They want to be in politics. They want this land. They want us to help them. Slaves won't ever do that because we won't let them go free. And that might be worth the initial investment. And so that's going to be the reason why slavery will start to pick up. It's going to be seen as a better economic choice. I put my kid to sleep by talking about history. So interesting. In the north, you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony as well. Obviously, the Pilgrims are the group that comes over first. This is for religious persecution. They don't feel that they would be represented, and they're not being able to participate in the religious situation as is with the Church of England. So they decide, you know what, we're going to leave. I do want to point out they are a subset of Puritans. Puritans also don't like what is going on, but they decide, you know what, we can change this. There's some reform attempts we can make, and the Pilgrims go, no, we're out. And so they end up leaving. My wife's calling me too. She knows I'm doing this. Anyway, when the Pilgrims come over, that's Plymouth, right? Like the Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving, Powhatan, Massasoit, things like that. Massasoit and Squanto. So we're going to set them aside. For the most part, the significant impact is going to be the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and those are the Puritans. Sorry, I got to text my wife. Excuse me. You do have the Mayflower Compact. I guess before I move on from the Pilgrims, you do have the Mayflower Compact, which is going to be kind of this first type of constitutional, this idea of we're going to kind of all work together. The men are going to work together. They're going to have a voice. We're not just going to be a representative government, which is something that you would see with the House of Burgesses. You've got the Puritans. They're super strict. I would be on the lookout for something about the Puritans because that's a well that APUSH likes to go back to, and specifically about their society. That's something that you can see very socially different than you'll have in the Chesapeake region and in the South and even the Middle Colonies. So keep an eye on that. Of course, we're talking about really strict, really religious, city on a hill, be a perfect model. We're talking about the Salem witch trials, things like that. Although I do want to point out, and we even showed you this as a document in APUSH, not everybody in Puritan society was feeling that way. Some of them just wanted to fish. And so that's some important nuance to keep as well. While yes, most of the people are doing that, you do have a subsection of the who don't. And I'll point out the halfway covenant as well, which is going to be something that'll be implemented to help bring people back to the church after they've been leaving it. So there is some change in that society as well. For their economy, they're primarily going to be farmers, and then eventually you'll see that start popping into some larger economic schemes. So a lot of trading, some raw materials, and that'll start going as the North kind of quickly increases the diversification of their economy instead of just doing the cash crops that the South will be known for. The middle colonies are kind of a mix of both. You're religious, but yet we're going to be tolerant, and of course, tolerant as long as you're Christian. If you're not Christian, then we won't be tolerant. Excuse me. You have New York or New Amsterdam, based upon the trade that the Dutch were known for. You have Pennsylvania, the Holy Experiment, and William Penn and the Quakers and things like that. So pretty progressive for the time period. And their treatment of the natives is generally better than you're going to see up north. And I didn't mention this, but you are going to have King Philip's War in the north, and that's going to be kind of the signifier that, all right, Europe has taken over. England is now in control of New England, and it's not the Native Americans. For labor, I've got this. You, of course, should know about the Middle Passage, and I've got a kind of picture of there up here of this. Slave labor starts as Native Americans, and then it'll quickly increase into Africans. I will point out Native Americans start dying really quickly. There's a percentage of, like, in the 100 years after Columbus, like 90% of them die. And a lot of this is just math. We're doing it kind of guessing at it. But the disease plays a substantial impact in the decline of the Native American population. So the Middle Passage is that part of the triangular trade where you have Africans being brought over. Barbaric conditions, it's not great, but I feel like you know about that. We mentioned indentured servants already. I do want to point out something for women, because I think this new APUSH thing for the last couple of years, they're going to be focusing on groups that they don't think teachers talk about. So a couple years ago, it was women during market revolution and women during the World War II. Right? And I think you're going to see some of these things. So I would look back thematically at different people groups throughout history, and always keep in mind, is this something that most teachers would be talking about? So I mentioned this to my spring class today, the idea of what conservative interpretation of history is and what liberal interpretation of history is. Think about that. I see them going more in liberal interpretation, including groups that historically haven't really been talked about. So keep an eye on that for some of the written questions, because I think that's what you'll see. So in saying that, I want to talk about the role of women at this time, because we kind of gloss over this, and we're just like, until 1920, women stay in the homes, and then they get to vote, and then in the 50s they go back in the homes, and then they kind of trickle out with Rosie the Riveter and stuff like that. It's definitely more complicated than that, and this isn't going to help you much because it's backwards. But here at the bottom, there's this little kind of flow chart of what happens. In colonial times, death is like really common, and so people died. And so it would not be uncommon for mothers to die in childbirth. That was a significant killer of women. But it allowed women to have a better standing in society, because so many people were dying, and you just running out of adults in general. And so they could own property. They got the things that were passed down. If their husband died, those are all options. Oh, it's not backwards for you. It's just backwards for me. Oh, perfect. Anyway, and so they hold these better situations in general, and then death rates start declining. And as death rates decline and the husbands live longer, they start passing down their estate to the oldest son, and it starts bypassing the wife. And that's going to enter into, and I'll even pause here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later with the idea of Republican motherhood and things like that. But after that, you have the cult of domesticity, where you're literally cutting women out of property ownership, period. That's not what it was at the beginning because of the death rates. Salutary neglect and mercantilism, those are some significant economic terms you should know. The Navigation Acts are restrictions England passes on their colonies to try and control trade, but it is not enforced. That's the salutary neglect angle. The example I always use, and you're not one of my kids, I hope Turner mentioned it, but it's the idea of a curfew. right? So if your parents have a strict curfew when you start freshman year, and then they never punish you, let's say you have to be back by 8 o'clock or something, and you come back at 8:20, 8:40, 9, 10, 12, and no one ever punishes you or does anything, you're just not going to follow the rules. And then what happens is we're going to get down to your senior year. You're going to come home at like 9 o'clock, and your parents are going to freak out on you, take your phone, take the card, take all of these things, and you're going to feel very violated. This isn't fair. When, I mean, it was the rules in the beginning. Like, those are the rules. They were never enforced, so you never felt them. That's exactly what's going to happen here with the colonies. So mercantilism is built so that the mother country, England, is going to make more money. Some things for pre-revolutionary thought: definitely be clear about the Enlightenment. We're having this switch from more religious thought to more political and like logical and realistic and rational type thoughts. And there is this big push for liberty. What does liberty look like? And they're saying liberty is not going to look like a mother country making money off of us when we're so far away. Don't forget Peter Zenger and his trial and that freedom of the press. And then with that, I'm going to move into Unit 2. So this is going to be 1754 to 1800. Before I do, are there any questions on the time period that I just did? I'm going to move forward just talking, so I'm not sitting here just doing nothing. But if you want to type those in, I'll answer them as I go forward with this. Excuse me. So the French and Indian War is kind of our dividing line between, for us, Units 1 and 2. And the French and Indian War starts period 3, which will be the most substantial part, as I mentioned earlier. This is fought over the Ohio River Valley. It's basically, we're moving west, and the Native Americans are also out there, and it's coming to a head. And then at the same time, you have the French coming down. There's kind of the map a little bit. What you have, for the most part, and this doesn't include it, but down Mississippi, down the Mississippi River, you also have the French going there and settling in New Orleans and things like that. Excuse me. So we start having these clashes, and we have the Albany Congress, where we're like, hey, all of us colonies are also having these same experiences. Why don't we link up and form this unity? That's suggested by Benjamin Franklin. And the response is, no, we don't want to do that because we don't trust this unit coming together or anything like that. This is where that whole join or die and the snake cut up, that's where it comes from. It doesn't come from the revolution, although we kind of popularize it with that, and we'll bring it back to that. So the war itself is between the French and their Indian allies, and the British, their colonists, and their Indian allies. Most of the Native Americans are on the French side because the French weren't really bad to them. So the French have a lot of intermarrying that they do. They trade furs with the Native Americans. That's how they make money. And so, yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. And so what they do is they make friends with them because they need furs. And so they're going to be more friendly, whereas the British colonists aren't. So Victoria's question was, can you talk about the differences between the French, Spanish, and Dutch settlements? So I just kind of did the French a little bit. The French are going to come over for some missionary reasons. The economics are going to be furs. Primarily, you're going to see men coming over, and you will see a substantial amount of intermarrying between the men and the Native American women. And I say intermarrying and not rape because a lot of it is like family units. There probably is some of that kind of forced coercion, things like that as well. But I'm going to contrast that with the Spanish, which is much more aggressive and much more, and that's the encomienda system, and they're going to actually enslave them. Spanish are coming over for those, God, glory, gold, those sort of things. They are coming over to make money, and then they think they're going to do that by mining, and then it quickly becomes, we're going to have to farm, and they enslave the population and things like that. Don't forget about De las Casas. He's a significant person to know at that time because he's kind of calling this out. He's saying, hey, I think we're being really bad to them and we shouldn't do this. But he also is saying we should assimilate them. Their culture is not superior. It's not even like ours. They should become like us. We should Christianize them, but let's just not do this stuff. So there's some nuance and some complexity there. And then the Dutch really just want to trade. And so they come over and they're like, oh, sure, whoever you are, come down and trade with us. So I would make the argument that you couldn't say the French or the Dutch are better people or they're more accepting of other people's differences. they just have an economic incentive to not have people be angry at them. And the Spanish had an economic incentive to have free labor, and they're going to go get that free labor. So I would argue throughout history, watch the economic incentives and see how people change for that, which is a little cynical, but I think there's some history in that. Anyway, back to the French and Indian War. It's not going well for the British. This is a world war, the 7 Years' War, and so it's kind of happening all over the place, and it's not going real well for the British. So William Pitt's going to have his blank check. Let's spend any amount of money, and that is going to lift them out of it. They are going to win. The key, though, is it costs so much money, and then when it's over, the colonists go right back over, and they're like, oh, yeah, it's our new land, and they go out there, and then the Native Americans don't agree to the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Like, they don't think they lost. They're just like, oh, they stopped. And so they start fighting the colonists again. This is Pontiac's Rebellion. And so England is like, okay, so you went over and you started this war and it cost us a bunch of money, and now it's over and you're doing the same thing. Stop. And so that's the proclamation line. They're going to actually literally draw a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and they say, colonists, you can't go over there anymore. And so the colonists feel betrayed. Like, we fought for this, and we won, and now you won't let us have this land. So this is every child when their parent is like, no, you can't have this thing. No one likes being told what they can and can't do. And so this is going to be kind of the first step in this process that's going to lead to, eventual revolution. There's that. I told you about that. Excuse me. Parliamentary sovereignty is going to kick off after this, after the French and Indian War. It's going to be ending salutary neglect, and now Parliament's in charge. You guys, there's all the different taxes, right? Sugar, stamp, quartering tea, intolerable, all of that. The thing that I want to point out is it's not necessarily that the money that the colonists are upset about. Like, yes, they make less money than they did before, but they're still making a good chunk of money. It's the idea that Britain can do this that upsets them. And a great piece of evidence for that is the Stamp Act gets repealed. So the Stamp Act's our first major one. That's a tax on paper products. The colonists get super upset. There will be a repeal, and then, excuse me, and you write to this repeal, and it says, yeah, we're going to take it away, but we can do this if we want. And that's going to be something really significant, because it's not so much, there's an argument that it is inevitable for this war because it's the idea that Britain can do this. That's the problem, not necessarily their actions of doing it. It's the idea that they can. You're going to start seeing colonial unity with Stamp Act Congress, Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty. We'll shout out the Edenton Tea Party in North Carolina, because North Carolina claims, like with the Mecklenburg Resolves and whatnot, that we actually declared independence before the rest of the country. So that's what's on the flag for North Carolina. So we claim that. Anyway, you're starting to see signs of rebellion. I do want to point out, while I'm arguing this inevitability, maybe not. Like, we start with a proclamation line, and at this point, there are some people who are like, yeah, we want to move on. We don't want this. But a good chunk of people are like, just make some changes. We'll be okay. Moving on. You're not going to see the Patriots numbers increasing until all of a sudden these actions start being more and more aggressive, and you'll start seeing the number of Patriots start increasing. I say Patriots to mean people who want independence. So there's some great complexity in there. In fact, 2 years ago, this was the DBQ question, which you guys probably practiced with. Excuse me. There are definitely signs of rebellion: the Boston Massacre, tarring and feathering of tax collectors, the Tea Party, things like that. The real chain of events that start getting really significant, and I'm going to run through this a little quickly because I don't think they're really going to hit the actual American Revolution fighting, because they know we talk about that. And it was the DBQ a couple of years ago. But you have, you have the Boston Tea Party. And then in response to that, the British are going to have the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. In response to that, you have the First Continental Congress. So these colonists are coming together. They write the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Hey, we have a problem with this. Please change it. But no, we're still your loyal subjects. Send that off. He ignores it. Then you have Lexington and Concord. We're actually fighting them. Shout out to Paul Revere. And then you'll move into the Second Continental Congress, and we start having, and this is a broader time, period. So we have a lot of things happening. At the beginning, it's like, oh crap, we're fighting a war. Let's get some soldiers in here. Let's form an army. Let's get Washington in command. And then we send out the olive branch petition, another one. Hey, no, like, sorry, could you change this? I don't really like what you're doing, please. But we're still your subjects. And then that is not responded to, and eventually they are going to declare independence. Here's this. Advantages, disadvantages. There's a bunch. I mean, there's all of that. Actually, I don't know what I just did, and if you saw that or not. Here's this, if you didn't see it. And then I'll also kind of go over to this. Goals, strategies, tactics, important leaders, things like that. I'll run through it kind of quickly. The American colonies' goal is staying alive. Like, they just need to not die. They need to not lose their army. George Washington's kind of a disaster in the French and Indian War, but he'll be a very good general during the American Revolution because he's like, all right, let's just not lose our army. So they want to run up as high of casualties as they can on the British and drag out this war. So eventually they go, this isn't worth it, and move on. The British faced a difficult task. Definitely make connections if you can, if they're talking about military aspects, between this and the exact same things we're going to deal with in Vietnam and what we're dealing with in Iraq and Afghanistan. The notion of, yeah, we're a giant big country and we have a big army, but we're facing a group of insurgents who just like will do anything to not get captured, and they don't have like an army or a state. Like, you can't just defeat them. And that is that's really hard to win. And so that's going to be something from that time period as well. The timeline: Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill is a significant battle, Saratoga, turning point in the war. France starts stepping in, and they decided, yeah, I guess we'll help you. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were over there doing that as well, trying to get the French involved. You have Valley Forge. We almost lose our army in the winter in Pennsylvania, and Washington convinces them to keep going. Yorktown, obviously, the surrender. Treaty of Paris in 1783, we got our independence. Great. Concurrent with all of this, you have the Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at government. I cannot stress this enough. They're disaster. They're horrible, but they were intentionally made that way, and the Founding Fathers aren't dumb for that. Like, we look back on it and we're like, how could you? Disaster. But they're coming off some pretty significant trauma in they had someone who was singularly in command, and then Parliament, and this lack of representation, and that was a tremendous problem. And so their solution is decentralize as much as possible, have a very weak federal government, and then have powerful states, because the states are more representative of the people. They're closer connected. And so that is going to be the reasons they build that. Before I get into all of their failures, the only real strengths or successes, there's going to be the ceding of land that the states get from this Northwest Territory that gets added right there after the Revolution. And they'll divide that land up. This is the little chunks they divide it into. It makes it a little more orderly, and it is the only way they can really make money besides asking the states for help. The Northwest Ordinance is going to establish a system, a pecking order, a checklist for how you can become a state. 5,000 people, you get a self-governing legislature. 60,000 people, you apply and petition for statehood, and you then get accepted and that sort of thing. And they did outlaw slavery in the Northwest Territory. Weaknesses: there's no president. Congress has 13 votes. It's unicameral. Every state can send between 2 and 7 people, but they only have 1 vote. That means Virginia would have the same power as New Jersey, even though they don't have the same amount of people. And that's a problem if you are Virginia, but not if you're New Jersey. There's no power to enforce the laws. They leave that up to the states, so the states don't actually have to enforce laws that happen. They can't regulate trade. This really comes to a head and shows the significant problem with Shays' Rebellion. So you have poor farmers rebelling in Massachusetts and Western Mass, and then the government can't stop it because there's no army, there's no money. How are we going to do this? And so the Massachusetts militia actually stops it. And that's when people kind of look around and go, I think we need to fix this. There are some problems. That'll lead to the Constitutional Convention. The start of it initially, or the idea is, we're just going to make some few tweaks, a little change, and then we're going to move on. And that's not what happens. You have an entirely new document created. And so all sorts of compromises. The Great Compromise, the Virginia and New Jersey plans are going to set that up. I mean, I'll just put that here. You guys can come back to that later if you want. This is just kind of basic content stuff, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. The key is we're going to start seeing, we're going to add a president, and we're going to have a bicameral Congress. The Three-Fifths Compromise, this is about how are we going to count African-American slaves for representation and population, as population for representation, and how are we going to count them for taxation. The North wants to count them for taxes, so the South pays more taxes, and yet don't want them to count for representation, so the South doesn't get more representation, and the South is the reverse. And instead of splitting it down the middle, 50-50, they go 3/5. So if you ever wondered how much did America value the life of an African-American at the time, it was 3/5 of a white person. You have the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. We're going to end up ending the slave trade, but it's going to have to come years down the line. You also, and I don't have it on my slides here, but I'll mention it, you have the Electoral College Compromise and things like that. So it's important to know about those compromises and the different elements that go into play for that. For the ratification, there is a struggle with it because there's a group of people, the Federalists, who want the Constitution. But the Constitution is arguing for a strong federal government, well, stronger federal government. And that's a huge problem for America. Definitely watch this trend throughout American history. What should be the power of the federal government? I know if you're in the spring right now, we're just finishing up the New Deal and moving in through World War II. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, we think the government should take care of our economic livelihood and all these things. You look modern day, we're saying, oh, the government should be there to make sure we have health care, to make sure we have regulated business practices, breaking down monopolies, things like that. Like for tech companies, and Elizabeth Warren has suggested some of these things. And so it's interesting to see us go from no states to, yeah, we're totally okay with this. And so watch that trend over time. The Anti-Federalists don't want this to happen. And the only reason they will end up conceding and ratifying the Constitution is because of the addition of the Bill of Rights. There's also the Federalist Papers. You can talk about those as well. For Washington, so we'll just do Washington and Adams, and then we'll stop for today, and we'll do the rest on other times. So here's my rundown for Washington. This is what I'll do for most of the presidents, just who they are, and then some rundown on there. So I'll leave this here for a second. He is on the $1 bill, if you didn't know that. The big part of Washington for his presidency is his cabinet. He has Hamilton and Jefferson in there. You need to know the relationship and the dynamic between Hamilton and Jefferson. They are very significant founding fathers for this whole system of government kind of as we know it. And I do want to do this. Like, I know a lot of you may be familiar with Hamilton, the musical, and that sort of thing. And we're very often there's this kind of liberal attitude. And I think even Lin-Manuel Miranda has said about this, about how his line is, you know, basically he's an immigrant. He came from nothing and worked his way up. And that is all very true. But I do want to point out he doesn't trust the general public. He very much is in favor of having an in-between, like the Electoral College, which we are all talking about changing now, of having an in-between between the public and actual final decisions. And that's not really our definition of liberty. So keep that in mind as we start looking at Electoral College and things of that nature. Anyway, Jefferson and Hamilton have arguments over Hamilton's financial plan, which is to have those protective tariffs, Bank of the United States, assumption of state debts, the whiskey tax. And literally the two of them have a meeting and decide which of that's going to pass and what's not. And in this event, they decide to move the capital to Washington, D.C. to appease Jefferson in the South. So again, I want to point out there's no real democracy going on in that situation. It's two elites meeting together and saying, this is what America's going to do. So that's important to think about if you want to look at the democratization process throughout American history. You have the Judiciary Act for the judiciary. Britain and France are going to start some beef that's going to continue onward, and we'll deal with it throughout future presidents. In this case, Washington is going to make us neutral. Jefferson is saying, hey, we should support France. They supported us in our independence, and he was there. He feels for them. And Hamilton says, England's our trade partner. We need to be connected to them. And Washington goes, we're not going to get involved. There is the Whiskey Rebellion. That tax that Hamilton suggests and it gets put into place is going to lead to some problems. And there's a rebellion. Great comparison to Shays' Rebellion, because it's the same thing, except in this case, because of the power of the Constitution, Washington rolls on down and shuts the thing down, and they hang people and they end it. The federal government's in power. He serves 2 terms, like very famously, and his reason for that is he doesn't want to look like a king. He's afraid if he served a 3rd term and dies in office, FDR, that's going to lead to people believing, oh, this is like a king. You can do this for life. I always plug this point. If any of you have read Washington Irving's it's Lincoln, Rip Van Winkle. It kind of makes this comparison. So basically, Rip Van Winkle falls asleep during the colonial period, wakes up, the revolution has already happened. There was a tavern that had a picture out front of King George, and that's gone now and replaced by a picture of President Washington. And so that's Washington Irving's kind of commentary on, did we really change anything with that? This is still kind of a king figure. And as you start getting into FDR, who I name dropped a second ago, you start seeing this incredibly increasing power of the federal government, specifically in terms of the executive branch and the presidency. He very famously gives his farewell address where he says, hey, I'm worried about the North and the South and these future tensions. And everyone's like, yeah, we're fine. We got this. That'll lead to the Civil War. He also says, I don't like these political parties which are forming, which would be the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. This tension might be problems later. And we say, no, we got it. And yeah, it is. And then he also says, let's not make alliances with other countries. Let's only work with them for economic trade. His idea behind this is we're little baby America. We can't really get involved with this. We can't be dragged into war. And yeah, I mean, that's legitimate. Like, that's a legitimate thing. And we kind of listen. Like, we're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine later, and we do kind of stay out of these affairs, but not present day. Present day, we very much are involved in this. There's Hamilton's financial plan, as I mentioned. And then here's Adams, which will be our last thing. He's kind of a failure, just in general, him and his son. So, sorry. There is the conflict with France. We have this impressment that's going on, and so he sends a delegate or a delegation to France, and this seems really petty, but we get off the boat, and instead of being taken to the government, then they require we pay them a bribe, and America gets very offended. You've insulted my honor. You wouldn't do this to any other country. This is so wrong. And we get all emotional about it. People are like, war, war, war. We don't. And then people get upset at Adams. They start criticizing Adams. They start criticizing the Federalists. And then the Federalists, who are in power, come up with the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien part, which is going to target a significant amount of future voting people for Democratic Republicans. And they also are going to have the Sedition part, which is you're not really allowed to criticize the government. Well, that's a violation of your First Amendment rights. So kind of a problem. And excuse me. And people get really upset, which is going to be why he doesn't win the election of 1800. You have the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions by Madison and Jefferson, and they're going to point out this issue of nullification. This is going to pop up again and again and again leading up to the Civil War. Can states ignore and not follow acts of the federal government? And we don't solve it here. And we won't solve it the next time. And we won't solve it the next time until we get to the Civil War, which is kind of over this issue. And then we solve it because we have to fight a war about it. Okay. All right. That's it for my pre-prepared stuff. Go ahead. I'll wait for a second. If you guys have any questions, you can throw it in there. My plan is to do this again next week. Leave some comments in here if the day works. Was Wednesday fine? Would you prefer Monday? I won't be doing it Tuesday because that'll be my day. I guess I'll say this here. Tuesday next week will be when I start the writing review. A lot of you probably won't go, but it is really important, so I would encourage you to go. So there's that. No questions before. Five, four, three, two, different major political parties. For just during this time period, or the whole thing? Because if it's the whole thing, that's a whole nother story. Let me answer this. So different major political parties throughout American history. At this point, for what we've gone through, Democratic, Republicans, and the Federalists, you're going to see those continue. The Federalists will die at the Hartford Convention. Then you're going to have Democratic Republicans. Then you are going to have Jackson, and then you're going to have the Democrats, and then the Democratic Republican thing is going to die. You'll get the Democrats, and then you're going to get the Whigs. Those will continue on. You're going to eventually have the Whigs die out. You're going to have the Republicans come into play. Then you'll have Democrats and Republicans. Then you're going to have that continue onward. Then you'll have a flip in the parties, and then it's Democratic Republicans still kind of to this day. Oh, okay. Glad I did all that for nothing. All right. What do we need for writing review? You just need to show up. I'm going to do a little bit of multiple choice stuff probably, and then I'm going to talk about the rubric and give you some prompts and things like that. I'm not planning on having you sit and actually like legitimately write out an entire thing because that's just not enough time. So we'll talk about scaffolding and we'll structure it a little bit so that you can focus on specific parts of the rubric. Sykes on Tuesday? Yeah, the only day I don't pick up my daughter is Tuesday. So sorry. I'll talk to psych. I'll talk to the psych teachers and see if we can work something out with that. Differences between political parties again. Yeah, I guess I didn't really have that on here for the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Federalists are going to be the federal government, which would make sense in the federal. How long are we expecting writing review to last? I don't know. I'd peg in an hour, maybe. Again, I'm not going to have you sit down and write a DBQ. So we'll probably do a little bit, maybe 20, 30 minutes for multiple choice. And then we'll look at DBQ stuff or we'll look at the document thing. It's going to be stuff that I can't really do digitally here. Anyway, the Federalists. The Federalists are federal government. They're the elites. They're merchants, lawyers. They're primarily New England people. They're well off. They're going to support industry. They're going to support tariffs, those sort of things. Democratic Republicans are not really your elites. I mean, you have some be elites in that party, obviously, but they're going to be states' rights. They're going to be weaker federal government, more powerful state governments. They're going to be like Jefferson wants self-sufficient farmers. This notion of you shouldn't need to rely on anyone. You can provide everything for yourself. They're two very different fundamental schools of thought. If you want to carry those forward, a lot of those Federalist ideas still kind of align with what we would now have as the Democratic Party. The idea of the federal government is there to step into that. And the only issue here is kind of the people groups. The base isn't the same because we have a lot of big stuff we did before. So like African-American at this point in time, poor people aren't voting. There aren't unions. So those bases don't really make sense. And when we go back to Federalists and Democratic Republicans, but Democratic Republicans are more of a conservative view, and Federalists would be a little bit more liberal. But again, there's flexibility, there's complexity in here because Democratic Republicans are the ones for pushing this more aggressive chance at freedom. Jefferson says about the Whiskey and Shea Rebellion, he's like, yes. So he likens it to like a fire, right? Forest fire is good every now and then because it purges stuff. So they don't perfectly align with either of our parties, today. But those are some ways you could watch it. So always track those bases and see how they change as the political parties change. So that was that. Tuesday. I think that's all the questions. So I'll give you another little bit to ask questions, and if not, it has been a pleasure. You can tell other people that this is, I have this to record, so it'll be up there live so people can see it. Cool. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to chalk this up to being a success. Maybe for next week, I'll have figured out how to make my computer also show the screen so I can do two things at once. All right. Take care, guys.